Hurricane, The Ultimate Storm, by Arnaldo Ricciulli. Chapter 1. Black clouds filled the eastern sky, and that made Daniel smile. A storm was coming. He stood out on a small promontory at the end of the island and took another reading from his wind gauge. 60 miles per hour. He frowned, and not even Category 1 strength. All around him was the bounty of nature, palm trees, shrubs, and what have you. He wasn't a botanist, so he had no idea what some of the others were, and he didn't care. No, his focus was the storm that was fast approaching. Sitting down at his table in the tent, he moved one of the rocks he was using to keep the table in place. Writing wasn't easy. His long black hair kept batting him in the eyes. When he got back to the States, he really had to get a haircut. "Daniel!" someone cried. He heard but didn't reply. He was busy. He needed a more direct reading. Grabbing his gear, he stepped out of the tent and avoided getting smacked by the tent flap whipping about, and got another wind reading. Whoa, it was up to just over 80. Cool. Well into Category 1. At this rate, the storm might still be a 3 or a 4 when it made landfall. "Daniel!" came the cry again. He turned around. Huh? What? Oh, Dave, what's up, man? Bolting toward him was his partner Dave. Daniel had to grin. Dave looked like that old Buster Keaton movie. He couldn't remember the title. In it, Buster is in a town being hit by a windstorm, and he does the old walking against the wind routine, like some mime. Dave was lucky. He was short and a bit on the hefty side, so that made it easier for him to move about. Daniel remembered what the other team members called them, Rocky and Bullwinkle. After all, given Daniel's height and beanpole-like stature, the moniker seemed appropriate. Finally, Dave reached him. "What the heck are you smiling about?" "What? Isn't this awesome? Look at these readings. The storm's almost to Category 2, and it's still miles from making landfall." "Yeah, which means we need to take shelter. Come on. You need to think of your safety." Daniel frowned. Not that Dave's insult, he barely took note of that. No, it was his admonition that they should seek shelter that made no sense to him. "Dave, this is nature at its purest," Daniel said, even as the tent next to them twisted and bent. "Raw power, everything that man craves, and you want me to leave? I'm staying right here." Snap, whoosh, the tent took off, whipping off across the countryside like a kite set free from its master. Daniel bolted to the table to try and rescue as much of his gear and notes as possible. "Daniel, if you stay here, you're going to die. Now either come with me this instant or I'm leaving. You're on your own." "We all got to die sometimes, Dave. We come into this world under sentence of death, and the fates have already set the date and time." Dave rolled his eyes. "Fine, man, you're on your own. The team and I will be in the basement of the hotel if you change your mind." He didn't wait for a reply, just turned and headed back. Now the wind was his companion, helping him along the narrow, twisted dirt path that meandered from the adobe building to the open field. Daniel managed to secure several of his instruments and his notebook, even as the wind picked up again. Now it was gusting to nearly 100. He smiled and thought, now that was a storm. His glee was short-lived as an extra strong gust caught him, and whoosh, he was literally swept off his feet. Bam! He slammed into the muddy ground. Oh well, that was the point of these old bell-bottoms and his tie-dyed shirt. They were expendable work clothes. Crawling over to a clump of palm trees, he sat with his back against the largest. It was best not to try and stand now. Checking the wind again, he saw that it was now over 90. Yeah, a good storm. His face felt wet. Was he sweating? Well, yes, he was, but not that much. He licked his lips and tasted rainwater. Okay, the storm was breaking. Closing his notebook, he pulled out a Ziploc bag and stuffed the book inside it. There, now it was safe. He checked the sky. Wow, was it ever black? Looking at his watch, he saw that it was just about 10. Of course it was 10 in the morning, not 10 at night. A flash, followed by a boom. Wow, that lightning was close. More flashes. The sky almost returned to normal daylight as each bolt danced and arched across it. With that, the skies truly opened up and the rain fell. Oh, Daniel truly wished he could write all this down, but his memory was good. He'd jot it all down later. Right now, the important thing was to carefully observe everything that was going on around him. He had to pocket most of his instruments at this point. The wind was just too strong to chance losing them. At this point, the rain was smacking him almost perfectly straight into the face. Each drop was like a bee sting. Daniel looked around. He remembered that there was a small cave just a little way down the bluff toward the beach below the hotel. Yes, that would do. Pushing himself away from the tree, he got down on his belly and began to crawl. The rain continued to lash his face and back. Oh well, at least he'd get that mud off his back. But now his front was all messed up. What of it? By the time this day was out, he'd be soaked to the skin. Or dead. He didn't care. It was times like this that made life truly worth the living, and he was going to relish every moment of the event. It only took a few minutes to reach the cave, the brush and shrubbery whipping and lashing at him the whole way like some sort of botanical gauntlet. Crawling inside, he was out of the main blast of wind, but the rain continued to pelt him. It was a rough and rocky little hovel, but at least it was shelter. Now he could at least get his gear out of his pockets and lay them around him for easy access. Let's see, pressure was dropping, wind was up to 155, and the temperature was over 90. He checked his watch, an hour into the storm. Daniel began to do calculations in his head. Closing his eyes, he pictured a satellite view of the island, the storm, and its speed and course based on the current conditions. The storm was well and truly ashore. Now it was sure to reduce speed slightly, so the eye wall should hit in about 20 minutes, and then will come the calm of the eye. That meant it would be close to 2 hours before the storm moved beyond the island. Daniel opened his eyes and smiled. This was going to be great. As it turned out, his estimation was pretty darn accurate. The eye wall hit with all its murderous fury. Then came the calm of the eye. The sun even came out, briefly. And then the backside of the storm tore through the area. Before the winds had truly dropped off, but the rain had let up, Daniel gathered his gear, crawled out of his little burrow, and headed back toward the hotel. That is, he headed for where the hotel used to be. It had been flattened sometime during the course of the storm's passing over the island. Daniel smiled again. Cool, what a sight. Are you out of your mind? A voice off to the side growled. Daniel turned and saw Dave, Samantha, and Vernon, all members of his team. Oh, there you guys are, he said, his voice betraying his bright and chipper attitude. How you doing? Ready to get going? The three of them looked very unkempt and ill-tempered. Their clothes were torn and drenched, and Samantha's long red hair was dirty and matted against her white skin. Daniel wasn't sure, but he had a sneaking suspicion she was mad. Sammy was a tough Irish gal who, as they said, wore her heart on her sleeve, and all her other emotions for that matter. How are we? She snapped. How are we? You empty-headed pea-brain geek, take a look at us, you moron. How do you think we are? Alive and well, Daniel replied. Sammy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Daniel wasn't sure, but it actually looked like her red hair was leaking into her face. It went from its usual bleach white touched with freckles to pink, then red, and then deep crimson. Dave turned and comforted her. It's okay, Sam. Try to let it go. Daniel, do you have any concept of the danger we were in? Vernon asked. Look at that hotel. It went from a 6-story luxury adobe building to a pile of rubble. In a few hours, we were under threat. It's only by the grace of God that we and the staff lived. Wow, the storm really was something, wasn't it? Daniel replied. Vernon nodded. Yeah, it was, and so are you, and we're through. Well, of course we are. The storm's over, so let's get back to the lab and we'll... No, Vernon snapped. When I say we're through, I mean the three of us. We're through with you. We quit. We're out of here. Daniel was confused. What had happened to them? Dave, what's up? Dave, still obviously trying to calm Samantha, turned to Daniel. What's up is our patience with you, Daniel. We followed you from one storm to another, and all for the sake of the project. And at every turn you've ratcheted up the danger, Samantha added. Vernon nodded. Yes, this makes the third time you nearly got us killed. Whoa, wait a minute, guys, Daniel replied. I told Dave you guys could leave any time, and that only had to stay. Dave sighed. Yeah, you did, Daniel, but you didn't tell us the details on the storm until it was too late for us to get out of here. Daniel rubbed his chin. Oh, yeah, I didn't think of that. Samantha clamped her hands around her head as if it were about to explode. Daniel, for God's sakes, that's your biggest problem. You do not think. As far as we're concerned, 3 strikes and you're out, Dave said. We're heading back to the center of town, and then we're catching the first boat out of here. When we get back to Miami, we're tendering our resignation at the Institute. Goodbye, Vernon snapped. With that, the 3 of them started walking. Well, but guys, we have the presentation to the National Science Board next week, Daniel cried out to them. Don't you want to be there for that? It's the great breakthrough in... Samantha looked over her shoulder at him. Get lost, geekoid. With that, the 3 of them made their way along the narrow gravel road that connected the hotel to the town. Daniel stood there, unsure what to do. Well, if they didn't want to work with him anymore, it was their loss, not his. He looked around. Devastation was everywhere. Trees snapped like twigs, buildings crushed, cars and trucks reduced to twisted hunks of metal, and debris scattered across the countryside. His tent was long gone, although he did see a fragment of it in the sole surviving tree. As for his table and other gear, they were long gone, and there was no point looking for them. There was nothing here for him, so slinging his backpack over his shoulder, he set off for town. The harbour was a tangled mess of masts and cables, ships and docks. People were moving about the area, tending the injured, and trying to start the clean-up. Daniel had seen the aftermath of many hurricanes. He only knew too well what they were facing. Looking around, he could see the seaplane that had brought them to the island. It looked like a child's toy that someone had stepped on hard. Yeah, it wasn't taking them or him anywhere anytime soon. From experience, he also knew that communication would be out for a while, so no sense trying his cell phone. Until we could get to a working radio or phone, he'd do what he always did, help with the recovery. The best place to do that was at the local hospital. He shut his eyes and pictured the map of the city he'd studied when they arrived. Okay, the hospital was south of the harbour, about a mile away. 4 days later, Daniel finally got back to Florida and made his way to Miami and his office. He didn't particularly care for the city. He was a small-town boy, born and bred, yet if you wanted to study hurricanes, you had to go where the research facilities and the money were. It was like what his father told him about the criminal Willie Sutton. When asked why he robbed banks, he said it was because that's where the money was. Well, hurricane research was something that required a lot of money, and Miami, being a massive city of wealth and power, the citizens were always worried about hurricanes. It made sense. The more you had to lose, so that's where Daniel had to go to do his research. The people there were willing to part with the money he needed for his work. Still, it felt good to be back in the States. 4 days without a shower. Oh, he was rank. The people on the plane had given him plenty of dirty looks, so rather than head into the lab, he went home first and got cleaned up. Somehow standing in his own shower, that hot water trickling down his back, nothing is more refreshing and cleansing. After that, he dragged his razor across close to a week's worth of growth on his face and put on some clean clothes. Later that day, he got into the lab and started sorting through the crap on his desk. His office was the absolute stereotype geek scientist's hangout. It could have been a nice place if it were properly decorated. But Daniel didn't care about such things. The wall across the door was a wall of glass and could afford a great view of downtown Miami, if it weren't covered by plans, blueprints, satellite images and so on. As it was, it could be high noon and the office was dark as midnight. The other walls were a mishmash of filing cabinets, mostly empty, their contents strewn across several tables and a desk, 4 different computers, 2 printers and a half a dozen toy submarines. As far as Daniel was concerned, this was his true home. Under the desk was a sleeping bag, and he spent more nights curled up in it than in the bed of his apartment. He had to laugh. His bed was the one truly clean area of his apartment. He was in it so rarely it actually managed to stay neat and tidy. But right now he had no time for naps or studying the latest hurricane forecasts. No, he was due in the main conference room for a presentation before the National Science Board. It took a few minutes to sift through his papers and find the documents he needed, but he found them. Stepping out into the main office space, he poked his head into the first cubicle. Most of the open central space was divided into workstations by partition walls. The first one was Dave's, but he wasn't there. Daniel frowned. That was strange. He was always in early. He checked on Samantha and Vernon. The same thing. Daniel rubbed his chin. Had they really quit? Now why would they do that? Sure, they'd threatened to do it after the storm, but he figured they were just blowing off steam. Still, he couldn't stand around waiting for them. He had a presentation to make. Drat, he counted on them to help with the PowerPoint presentation. Well, he'd just have to handle it himself. So he headed down the hall. It wound around the large round conference room, and he finally reached the double doors that gave access to the room. With his arms full of his stuff, it was tough to grab the handle, but he managed. He froze right there in the doorway. Everyone was already there. Drat, late again. And here he thought he'd be on time for a change. The room was vast, more of an auditorium or conference hall than a mere conference room. High with a domed ceiling and a large oval-shaped table at the centre surrounded by many rows of seats. Daniel had always said that the room reminded him of the UN Security Council chamber. Right now, a dozen people sat around the table, and he couldn't help but think that they did sort of look like a mini-UN, black, white, Asian and so on, a very diverse group. Right at the head of the table, the place he always took, was Steve. Oh wait, he didn't like Daniel calling him that. Yes, Mr. Soldier Man was insistent. It was General Stefano Lowe. Moving down the aisle, Daniel took the seat nearest the whiteboard and then set his laptop, plans and papers down. "Morning, General," he said brightly. Stefano pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose and stared at Daniel. The General was nearly a head shorter than Daniel, but he made up for that with pure attitude. He had a commanding presence, but then that was to be expected. You didn't get to be a 3-star general in the US Army without that, although Daniel had always wondered just what sort of a soldier Stefano truly was. He wasn't a very old man, Daniel had never asked, but he looked to be in his early 40s. So just how many wars or battles could he have been in? Stefano had only ever spoken of the First Gulf War, and Daniel had known him for several years. He knew that Stefano had not served in the Iraq invasion or liberation, whatever people chose to call it, or Afghanistan. So just how good a general is he? Still, he always dressed so perfectly. His uniform was a veritable symphony of order and harmony. Straight lines, crisp, starched shirt, and shoes polished till their glare was practically blinding. He gave Daniel a very curt, sharp nod and then gestured at the people around them. Daniel only recognised one, Kelly Delaney of the National Hurricane Centre. Oh yeah, he met her at a protest of some sort, something to do with whales, global warming. Oh hell, he couldn't remember. Still, he liked her. She was cute and smart, and was it mentioned that she was cute? Now she was in her business suit, prim and proper, knee-length skirt, if a bit snug, blouse and a jacket, and her long blonde hair all bound up on top of her head. What did they call that? A beehive hairdo? No, they don't do those anymore. Anyway, he didn't think it was very complimentary. At the protest, he'd look great with raggedy jean shorts and a t-shirt and her hair down to her shoulders. Man, those shorts had really shown off her long legs. Oh well, maybe he could talk to her after the meeting. "Hey Daniel, how you doing?" she asked, extending her hand to him. He shook it and smiled at her. "Getting by. The storm was awesome, and I got plenty of data from my new system too." "Ahem," Stefano said, clearing his throat. "Patience, Daniel. Let's finish the introduction. That is, if you don't mind." Daniel sighed. Oh, Stefano could be so uptight. The man must have to take a dozen sleeping pills just to relax. Yet Daniel held his tongue for once and nodded. There followed the usual series of nods, handshakes and chit-chat as Stefano introduced Daniel to the other members of the board. He took a mental note of all their names and then hooked up his laptop to the projector. "All right, everyone, now that our speaker is here, let's begin," Stefano said. "First off, you may have heard that Hurricane Heidi proved very destructive to the Caribbean. Many islands were severely damaged, and it's only by the grace of God that Daniel here survived to come home to us." Kelly's brow wrinkled. "You're over there, Daniel, in the thick of it. When you said you gathered data on it, I figured you were in the lab, not out there." He nodded. "Yeah, it was an incredible event. We stayed in this cute little hotel. I'd tell you all about it, but it's not there anymore." "Daniel," Stefano snapped, "this is a scientific committee. We're not interested in a travel log of your trip. Get to the point." "Yes, you're right, General. Sorry about that," Daniel replied. He punched a key on his computer and the presentation started. Stepping over to the screen, he activated his laser pointer and gestured at the first image. "All right, this is a satellite thermal image of Heidi as she was gaining strength a week ago. Now, you see here in the center, these warm waters? Those are the suckers that are fueling this lovely storm. As you would say, General, this is the enemy." "Very good, Daniel, and what is your proposal for attacking that enemy?" Daniel advanced to the next slide, a graphic of a US Navy submarine. "Here it is," he said, his voice betraying his glee. He felt like a kid on Christmas. Kelly's eyebrows shot up. "A weapon of war? Daniel, you're not suggesting we use torpedoes as some other method of mass destruction, are you?" "Actually, the phrase is usually weapon of mass destruction," Daniel replied. "Whatever. They didn't find them in Iraq," Kelly said, "and I don't want to see them being used against nature. Remember the other phrase, it's not nice to fool with Mother Nature." Daniel raised his hands, gesturing for her and others to calm down. He could already read the concern on some of their faces. Now, hear me out." He clicked to the next slide, a cutaway view of the submarine. Most of the interior was gone, replaced by huge tanks, and tubes connected them to vents located along the top of the ship. "This is my plan. We take about 6 to 8 submarines and gut them out. Not completely, mind you, but the vast majority of their interior will be removed and replaced by these storage tanks." "Tanks? Containing what?" Mr. Duran, the vice chairman of the committee, said. "Liquid nitrogen," Daniel replied. Several jaws dropped, and even the general looked surprised. Oh yeah, they were blown away. "What for?" Kelly said. "When a storm is forming, we dispatch these subs. They move to the center of the storm and begin to circle just outside the limits of the eye of the storm. Now, as the eye of the hurricane can range from 20 to 40 miles in diameter, the subs must be placed about 5 miles apart from each other and move at a speed of 15 nautical miles. They then release the liquid nitrogen into the warm waters around them, and the water temperatures will drop slowly about 5 degrees per hour. Doing this would not only drop the water temperatures to 60 degrees, but also maintain the waters at that range till the storm drops in category. The experiment will have to be done between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., as that's when the water temperatures are at the lowest range." Kelly slowly rose to her feet. "Daniel, you can't be serious. Do you have any idea of the environmental impact of that would be?" Daniel rubbed his chin. "Impact? The water will get colder and a major storm will be dissipated. Think of the impact of not doing it. The liquid nitrogen that, when released, will have a temperature of about 371 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Everything around it, zap, frozen solid." Miss Einstein also rose. "Mr. Mayhew, a hurricane is part of the natural process. Whether or not global warming is real and whether or not it impacts the severity of storms is irrelevant. What you are proposing is a man-made disaster." "I don't understand," Daniel said. "This is liquid nitrogen. It's chemically inert. I'm talking about freezing seawater. It'll melt. Where's the impact?" "Daniel," Kelly snapped, "any fish or marine life in the area would also freeze. Have you forgotten that marine turtles are a protected species?" Daniel rolled his eyes. "Oh, for God's sake, people, this system would affect only a small area of the ocean, that zone feeding the hurricane. I think we need to put this into perspective. On the one hand, a few fish, squid and turtles, and on the other hand, thousands of people, hundreds of homes and businesses, and millions, if not billions of dollars of property. I'm sorry. For me, this is an easy call. For that matter, any sea life that's frozen can be picked up after the storm is stopped and put on supermarket shelves. What? Kelly shouted. Hey, it's just like they did it on The Deadliest Catch. Kelly rolled her eyes. Daniel, that is not funny. Well, I thought it was a real rib tickler. Stefano slowly stood up. Well, this is certainly an easy decision for me to make. Ah, thank you, General. I vote no. Daniel did a double take. What? General, why? I would think you'd favour destroying 6 Navy subs for some pipe dream of yours? What are you talking about? The subs will be fine, just changed a bit. Stefano gave a snort. Fine? Daniel, you're talking about taking them completely out of commission for the purpose for what they were intended. Do you have any idea of the costs involved? Daniel stepped over to his papers and shuffled through them. Let me see, I did a preliminary cost estimate for the... It doesn't matter, Stefano growled. Taking that many subs off the line, refitting them, and then the cost to put them back if the bloody thing doesn't work is not feasible. In addition, as Kelly and the others have pointed out... There, Mr. Durand and Miss Einstein, he said quickly. Now it was the General's turn to look surprised. Good God, how do you remember so much stuff? At any rate, as they've so aptly said, your plan will damage the environment. Kelly smiled. Why, General, I never would have expected you to be concerned about that. Yes, I know. I'm a warmonger and only concerned with death and destruction. Well, I'm not a stereotype, my dear. Touché, General. You make a good point, Kelly replied. Well, I'm with him. I vote no. The others voted. It was unanimous. The project was rejected. Daniel hung his head. I see. Very well. I can see that my work is done here. With that, the meeting adjourned and the people dispersed. Daniel gathered his things up and headed back up the aisle. Kelly fell in beside him. I'm sorry, Daniel, but I couldn't, in good faith, support your idea. It's okay, I understand. To be honest, I never even considered the possible negative impacts of the system. They headed out the door and turned to go back to his office. Tell you what, I think the underlying premise of your idea is still valid. Daniel smiled. Really? Huh. So maybe I'm going about it the wrong way? Kelly nodded. There you go. If you could find a way to cool the warm waters that feed the storm and yet not damage the environment in the process, you'd have a really viable solution. Boy, think about that, a way to destroy hurricanes. Yes, that's my goal, Daniel replied. Can you imagine that a world in which hurricanes never again threaten mankind? Think of the lives, the humanity, Kelly said as they reached his office door. Beg your pardon? You said mankind. The proper term is humanity, she said. Daniel smiled. Oh yes, I see what you mean. Care to come in while I pack? I've got the new mystery case files downloaded on my computer. Kelly laughed. No thanks, I've got to get back to wait. Pack? What? Why are you... I'm leaving, going home, he said, kicking the door open. Daniel, what? You're letting one setback cause you to heave to and come about? Come on, there's still so much. Bam, Daniel dumped his things onto his desk. Kelly, I'm not cut out for this kind of stuff, all this office politics. People tell me stuff and I just accept it. I know, I'm too trusting. The point is my team's left me. General Steve, who said he would push my plan through, bailed on me and I've got nothing keeping me here. I'm going home and see about work there. Plus, I've got my dad to help. No, it's best I leave and continue my research at my own pace. Well, okay, Daniel, it's your life anyway. Good luck to you, Kelly said, seemingly at a loss for words. Good luck, I remember I already said that. Stay in touch and my best to your family. Daniel, intent on packing, barely noticed Kelly's outstretched hand. He gave it a shake. Thanks, and good luck to you too if you're ever in Port Charlotte. Look us up. Let's face it, Mayhew isn't a common name, at least not around Florida. She promised she would do just that if she came to visit her family. They lived in Arcadia, not far from Port Charlotte. Then she departed. Daniel continued to busy himself about the office. As it happened, he realized that most of what he had there was junk. He threw most of it out. He didn't have a briefcase, but he did have his old leather backpack that he'd used on all his journeys. Into it, he stuffed his plans and notes. Kelly was right. His theory was valid. It was the application that was faulty. He'd return home and begin again. A week later, Daniel packed up his few possessions in his old Volkswagen Bug and set out. He knew the path quite well. I-75 across Alligator Alley and then up the west coast of Florida. He'd be home in a few hours. Driving along, he thought about his destination, Port Charlotte, and his dad. How would he be, and how would Gabriella be? How long had it been? 6-8 months since his last visit? Yeah, it had been the end of the hurricane season last year. How he hoped his dad was improved. The interstate was a lonely stretch going across the Everglades, just a straight shot to the coast. Swinging up through Naples and Fort Myers, he smiled to see some of the familiar sights. Soon he was approaching King's Highway and the exit for Port Charlotte. The time of facing the music, as they say, was close at hand, and Daniel found that he was sweating.